Hi, are you Chris?
I'm James.
Okay. Do you know?
Oh, Chris. That's yours.
Okay. Are you in charge of doing the AV stuff?
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know anything about the holding?
I haven't been informed about anything.
Okay.
I received an
Oh,
email.
okay. We're just getting
I received an email yesterday about it. Someone asking me about what rate was it? I'm James.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So I've got two versions. 16 by 9.
And then you can put that in that room there. Okay. The only thing is that Mac? No, is it? It's right, that's the one that you want.
Oh, you just want to write it in here?
Yeah. We don't have any laptop things, so,
Okay.
other than what's been supplied by the vendor.
How's Mallory?
No, sorry. I think she's PA. You ever booked
Well, Julia, but
That's right. Yeah, because we've been talking about the break electric. That's all right. Selection of how much we put out.
okay, probably is now.
Yeah, that was requested by literally 5 minutes ago. So we'll have to some spares and all that.
Okay,
So we'll just have to
I saw the appointment. Yeah, just not.
see what it is. We have 2 spares on vans for other jobs. So we chucked an extra 2 in for you. Looks like we had more than that to be avoided.
1, 2, 2. Uh-huh. 1, 2, yes. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Now, maybe we're speaking to Chris about that as well, because he's using a feed on that side, so it just depends on...
It's all the same, so basically when it comes to it, place that laptop.
Are you okay to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah? Fine. And then that way we'll have quite even between them. Right, I'm going to go do another event quickly now.
Alright.
I will pop back to make sure that they get out there okay.
Okay, lovely.
I'm not sure really well. It ended up happening. But, you know, everything goes okay.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, bye-bye.
Hey, hey, up. 1, 2, 2, up. Hey, hey.
Actually, I'm just in charge of this lot, so I think the main guy who's sort of
I'll wait for
for
it.
tech should be coming in.
I'll wait for him.
Literally just point him out to you and see him.
I've got some more slides.
Okay. Yeah, I'm assuming so. Is that laptop up there? Okay, yeah, I can do. You should be able to plug it in up there.
Okay.
And then we'll just switch between that.
Yeah, so that's something that should just have on when there's something else going on.
I'll double check it all works up there.
I can work out how you get in.
Sorry, are you there? Sorry, I didn't. Go ahead.
Be the first panel right behind that, so
Can we get you all taking your seats, please? Testing. We gotta get this mic. Very well. Thank you. Okay, can we get you all to take your seats right away? We are already running behind schedule, but I guess that's normal for any conference. But we are going to catch up, and I hate to catch up. 27 people addressing you today, including myself. The other 26, I am sure, will have a lot to add. Real pearls from one of the greatest group of speakers. I can't thank you enough for all being here. My name's Mallory Factor. I'm going to try to guide you through the day and hopefully keep everybody somewhat on schedule as well. I just want to welcome you here. This is, as you all know, this is one of the greatest universities in the world and has such a rich history of major scientific discoveries. From William Harvey in the 17th century, who became the first known scientist to describe in detail the body's circulation and properties of blood being pumped to the brain and to the body by the heart. People like Howard Florey, Norman Heatley, Jim Kent, who led the trials of penicillin in Oxford over 70 years ago. John Goodfellow and John O'Connor, who developed the Oxford knee, which was first put in a patient in 1981. Obviously, the list goes on, and I don't want to bore you with a lot more names, because these are just a few examples of the terrific, outstanding science that has come out of this university, Oxford University. And of course, great science is coming out of other UK universities and scientific institutes. However, compared with US universities, UK universities and scientific institutes here are not seeing the level of translation and commercialization that their excellence in science should have, because their products are now making to the marketplace with the speed and rapidity of places like the United States, and a lot of the science can greatly benefit mankind. We've come together here today to discuss why the United States is so much more successful in spinning biotech companies out of the universities and translating its research better than the UK. In the press recently, there's been coverage showing that US universities give their scientists more control over their discoveries. Also, US universities ask for smaller percentages of equity in their spin-outs, in some cases 5% or less, and they move very rapidly. The US model is something that we will be carefully examining in this conference, since it works well for scientists and universities, and it fosters a very robust environment for bioscience startups. The UK government could also greatly improve the environment for bioscience startups. To improve competitiveness in the UK government needs to make it easier for scientists to do the research that's necessary for drug discovery. Recently, one scientist told me that if you want to kill 1,000 mice, you just go out and you get a license to be an exterminator. It's relatively easy to do. However, you want to use one mouse in scientific research, it could take 2 to 3 years to get the required approvals needed for the animal trials. The government needs to streamline approval processes with regard to bioscience to make it easier for scientists to pursue valuable research. Another key to improving the UK biotech industry is actually to provide a more positive environment for startup businesses generally, and ease the regulatory burdens and headaches of starting a company in the United Kingdom. And we also should ask ourselves, and there's a lot of people here who can address this, why the financial community does not embrace fully UK bioscience. What exactly is keeping the UK bioscience sector from flourishing? Increasing UK competitiveness in bioscience will create jobs, generate wealth for society, as well as for universities and institutes. Most importantly, Britain should improve technology transfer in order to make sure that valuable science being developed here contributes more to improving the world's public health. I ask you all here to reflect on what you hear today. You are all delegates at this important conference, and then give us your feedback. Give feedback to government, to universities, to the scientific institutes, to the financial community, to improve transfer and commercialization of the world-class, outstanding science developed here in the United Kingdom. I want to thank you all for coming today. I want to thank all of our sponsors up there, in particular OB and Nina, who's sitting down there, who worked to make this such a success, and John Reese, who also helped at the very beginning. This is an important program. We are not here to just talk to ourselves. Our goal here today is to find ways to help universities, institutes, scientists, and mankind in general. And I am just grateful that you're all here and attending. I am told this is one of the largest, if not the largest, biotech conference Oxford has had as long as people can remember, and it's because of you and your interest that it is such. At this point, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's going to basically welcome you here. And without him, this program, this conference, would have been cut short and not even existed. He's been head of the Department of Pharmacology since 2015. He joined the department in 2000 from the National Institute for Medical Research in London. He was one of the founding fathers of mammalian plasticity field, and he's worked to develop novel optical methods for imaging of synaptic activity in living neural tissue, enabling the first optical quantal analysis of plasticity to be performed. He's a professor. He was a graduate student in the Department of Pharmacology at the other place. And he worked there with Malcolm Burrows. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce my department chair, my friend, a great Englishman, a great person, Professor Nigel Emtage.
Okay, no pressure then. Goodness me. Thank you, Mallory. Okay, I'm going to keep it very short. You haven't come all this way to listen to me wax lyrical about the history of the department, but I thought it would be remiss of me not to say at least a few words to welcome you. So, in hosting the Pulse, the Pharmacology Department of the University of Oxford, in collaboration with Merton College, has embraced a challenge that I believe befits an institution with a 1,000-year history. It is welcoming through its doors industry and the investment community to meet our academics and hopefully facilitate dialogue in this open forum. We've got some fairly simple questions, and they've in a sense been enunciated by Mallory before me. In essence, it's how Britain can best capture its share of the bioscience innovation sector. And how do we maximise translation of what I certainly believe to be some outstanding research endeavours conducted both within Oxford and at other institutions in and around the United Kingdom and Europe. Our new Vice-Chancellor, Professor Louise Richardson, said earlier this month on her admission as Oxford's first female Vice-Chancellor, Oxford's mission requires ever more creativity, ever more innovation, ever more flexibility. We hope by engaging in the process that we're starting today, we're following her lead and in her wishes. Therefore, we've invited contributions from diverse constituencies so that they can offer their perspective on why the UK bioscience industry may not yet have quite fulfilled its potential from our great science base. I don't think I'm entirely speaking out of turn, because one only has to consult the reports of Sir David Cooksey, the BBSRC's TTZ report, more recently the Wellcome Bain IP review, along with the Dowling report, to make it clear that there really is serious work to be done. The efforts of this university and the Innovation Working Group represents a strand of movement that is intent on filling some of this gap. And the commitment's real. 320 million has been invested in the Science Oxford Innovation Fund. And so that's a real commitment to this ambition. Like many modern conundrums, the answer to today's questions are likely to be found through collaboration. I certainly know this in the context of my scientific work. And this is why we brought together this community, industry, academia, and the investment community, a veritable triple helix at this summit. It's a source of great pride that I'm able to stand here and say that the Department of Pharmacology within the university, through the work of luminaries such as Sir William Pateman, has contributed to the world's first effective drug for the treatment of blood pressure. Indeed, Professor Payton, working with his colleague Dr. Ng, also provided drugs for blocking neuromuscular transmission, some of which, remarkably, are still used today in intensive care units. Dr. Hugh Blaschko, a member of the pharmacology department of the university, for 41 years discovered the pathways for the biosynthesis of adrenaline. Edith Bulbring, first female FRS, almost single-handedly founded modern pharmacological study of smooth muscle, paving the way for a variety of new classes of drugs for the treatment of blood pressure. So, wonderful history, but are we to just rest on our laurels and basking past glories? Well, obviously not. Oxford's Department of Pharmacology sits squarely within the densest life sciences cluster in Europe, the so-called Golden Triangle. And the Golden Triangle is certainly aptly named insofar as within 2014, $700 million were raised in private and public markets financing Oxford-based life sciences companies. matching or exceeding all the other UK science clusters. By 2015, it was better still. Q3 saw that the cluster had accelerated by a further $1 billion. All indicative of progress, but not quite there yet, in the opinion of a good many that have scrutinised the detail in some considerable length. Now, I've no wish to second-guess the outcome of today's proceedings, but whatever form they follow, I'm delighted that pharmacology, in collaboration with Merton College, is able to host this exciting summit. Ultimately, we all share the same aim, to transfer the knowledge that are the fruits of our research into real benefit. Just remains for me to say to welcome you all to the Pulse. Thank you very much.
Well, I have some good news for you and some bad news. Sir David Cooksey will not be joining us today. He is in hospital with an infection that is resistant to antibiotics. But I do have some good news for you. The Deputy and Chief of Strategy from the MRC, as well as the gentleman who works closely with him at Crick, Director of Research, has agreed to come in and speak to us and include some of the comments that he was going to make. David wrote a report called the Cooksey Report, Sir David did, and it's the 10th anniversary of it. He was going to actually update us on it. There will be a working group which he has said he would participate in coming up with a report, and if any of you would like to participate in that working group, please let us know, and feel free to email the Pulse at Pharmacology, because we would like to include as many of you as possible. It won't be a lot of work. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce a gentleman who we called upon at the, I won't even say the 11th hour, I'll say 5 minutes to 12, and said, tell us what Cooksey was going to tell us, plus give us your own views. Dr. Jim Smith.
Thanks, Mallory. I should send you, of course, my best wishes from Sir David, who, as Mallory says, is in hospital at the moment. He's fine, he'll be better, he'll be out, but it's very sad that he's not able to be here this morning. It's very hard speaking in his place. It's one of the probably most nervous-inducing things I've ever done. It sort of reminds me, and this is maybe only the slightly older members of the audience will get this, but later on there's a session called White Light, White Heat. And I noticed that at the Ashmolean, there's an Andy Warhol exhibition. So it makes me think that you've arrived to hear the Velvet Underground and you've only got the garage band next door. So some people smile. That's an old person's joke. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about translation, as I think you might have heard from David. I am not David, however, and I cannot speak for him and wouldn't even really try. What I will do is spend most of my time talking about the institute of which he is the chair, whose foundation is really designed to take forward some of the things that were outlined in his report of 2006. And this is the front page of that report. We could probably have the lights down a tad, because there'll be some pictures later on. This is the front page of his report. And those of you who have committed the report to memory, as I'm sure you will know that there is no overarching UK health research strategy to ensure UK health priorities are considered through all sorts of research, and there are two key gaps. Two key gaps, David said. Translating ideas from basic and clinical research into the development of new products and approaches, and implementing these new products and approaches into clinical practice. These are the two gaps he's identified. What I'm going to speak about particularly is the beginning of the first gap, translating ideas from basic and clinical research into the development of new products and approaches. And I have a view that this is down a great deal to people and people speaking to people, and I shall explain what I mean about that later on. I do have a slide that I took from yesterday's Daily Telegraph that might suggest that things aren't quite as bad as they are, or maybe they're improving, and this is a slide from yesterday's Telegraph, UK in a life sciences renaissance as funding booms. I'm sure Mallory will tell us that it's a blip, but we shall see. Maybe there's hope in the future. So let me tell you about the CRIC. This is an institute whose objective, it's a new world-class medical research institute striving to understand and overcome the most basic, significant diseases which are affecting people now. So we're trying to understand disease and find what we can do for treatments. The board is chaired by David Cooksey, so you can imagine that what we're trying to do chimes very well with his report of 2006. Sir Paul Nurse runs the institute. I'm sure many of you know Paul. He was the head of the biochemistry department here for some years. It's a big research institute, but not that big, and we can discuss the size later on if you're interested. It's about 120 research groups. And most interestingly of all, it's a 6-way collaboration between the Medical Research Council, who I work for, the Wellcome Trust, CRUK, Cancer Research UK, Imperial College London, King's College London, and University College London. So there are 6 partners in this enterprise. And what I say wittily sometimes is that having 6 partners involved in something increases the complication by around 2 to the power 6, because everybody's got to interact with everybody else. It is complicated, but the vision behind it and the enthusiasm behind it means that these 6 organizations are in fact working very well indeed together. We are slap bang in the Golden Triangle as well. So this shows you where we are physically, and those of you who came through London or will be going home through London, I'd encourage you to get off the train at Paddington, then take the Circle line around to King's Cross, which is where we are. So we're in St Pancras. The red spot there, I have a pointer somewhere, but I won't use it. The red spot at the top is where we are. It's close to St Pancras railway station and therefore Eurostar. It's close to King's Cross, so we can get up to Cambridge via GSK. We can get up to Edinburgh. It's perfectly placed for transport links, and it's perfectly placed for interactions with hospitals and universities. So we really like where it is. Those of you who know London well will recognize from here, I'm going to find my pointer. So the Institute is that modern-looking place. Hang on a second. I have a pointer in here. Never travel without a laser pointer. So the Institute is there. That's the Eurostar exit from St Pancras. That's King's Cross. That's the British Library. So we're slap in the middle of London. It's a fantastic location. So what is the CRIC trying to do? What are its plans? And we have 5 objectives in our recently issued book, Discovery Without Boundaries. And the first is we do want to discover without boundaries. I'll explain what I mean by that. We want to create science leaders. Importantly, we want to collaborate, we want to accelerate translation and engage and inspire the public. In what I'm going to say to you today, because of time constraints, I'm going to focus on numbers 1, 3, and 4. I won't speak about engaging the public. I'll mention en passant creating future science leaders, because I think that's a very important thing for the industry so that we get good scientists into becoming scientists, because if we don't do that, we are lost. So I'm going to speak about those 3.5 things in the remaining 11 minutes or something like that. Discovery without boundaries is very important, and you won't be able to read this slide, so I won't make you look at it too much. You can look at me. The point about discovery without boundaries is that we know, I think very well now, that in order to achieve success in medical science, we cannot rely solely on looking at molecular biology. We can't rely solely on looking at physiology or even pharmacology. We need to bring together the physical sciences and chemistry and computational biology and engineering. And one of the things the CRIC is moving towards is to bring all the life sciences with the physical sciences in a single institute. And this you will hear about in a moment, But let me also add that what we are trying to do is to be brave and to do new things at all times. And those of you who read the papers and watch the news will see that the Crick is the first institute in the UK to get a license for modifying human embryos. So we are at the cutting edge. We're willing to do those experiments that we think are important, that will actually make a difference. And some of you may have seen pictures of my young colleague Kathy Nyakan, who's working on this at the moment. So we are pushing the boundaries, we are bold, we are interesting. I will mention future science leaders because that is a very important part of what we are going to do. And we have several ways of approaching this. One is we want to recruit the best scientific athletes. Now, what I mean by that is many research institutes will have, for example, will be an institute of something like infection or regenerative medicine or structural biology, and they will recruit people in those areas. And if you lose somebody in a particular area, then you will recruit back into that area. In that way, though, what can happen is that an institute stagnates. You'll be recruiting people on the basis of what they do rather than on the basis of their scientific excellence. We are recruiting solely on the basis of excellence, so that when we get people in, the excellent work that we do will be driven by the quality of the people we hire. Very important. We will have more clinicians in the institute than we have had in the two two institutes that have come into one to make the Crick. We have a new career structure to encourage group leaders to come in and do exciting, innovative, long-term work. We will give postdocs longer contracts so they don't need to eke out their life from 2-year contract to 2-year contract. We will be flexible and family-friendly. You will know that in academic life, certainly, 50% of the graduate students, 50% of the postdocs are women, but as soon as you move into senior levels, into people running laboratories, the number of women running labs moves down to 16% or thereabouts. What this means is that we are losing 30% of our best scientists simply because they do not have a Y chromosome. We are going to address that. We will be multidisciplinary, as I'll explain in a minute, and we will train clinicians. Collaboration is very important, and the collaboration we'll do at the Crick will come from our interactions with the universities. And some of you may have seen, under the heading of collaboration, an article by Phil Sharp. He calls the bringing together of different disciplines convergent. So you're converging maths and physics and engineering with the life sciences to create a single science. And that convergence, as I said earlier, we think is going to be one of the things that will make the Crick really work. And we're doing this, in particular, by collaborating with the Crick's 3 partner universities, King's, Imperial and UCL. But we will also be reaching out to universities around the country, and we are working with Oxford, for example, already. So we'll be doing partnerships in such a way that people from the 3 partner universities will either send their groups into the Crick, so we'll have people, whole lab groups seconded into the Crick, so physicists and chemists. We will have satellite groups where somebody may send some people into the Crick, a small number of people working with a Crick lab, or we will have sabbaticals. We've been through 1 round of this process, and so far we've made 19 awards of people coming in from the universities, 6 secondments, 10 satellites and 3 sabbaticals. Half of the people coming in are women. I think that's very important. The next round's about to begin, and this pie chart here shows you that we're fulfilling our objective of bringing in sciences that otherwise wouldn't have been in the Crick. So the collaboration creatively is working well. Now, I'll finish in a second, but I want to finish on the thing that I think is the most important for the Crick. And before I show you a slide on it, I'll explain what I mean. My experience, let me tell you what I do as a scientist. I am a frog embryologist. I've been a frog embryologist since I was 23, 24. I'm a very good frog embryologist. I was probably, for a period, the best frog embryologist, certainly in Europe. I mean, you might think it's a small pool, to stretch the frog analogy a little bit, but I was the best frog embryologist in the country. And I didn't give, there's a sign at the back saying 1. Does that mean I was #1 frog embryologist, or I've got 1 minute? 1 minute. I thought it meant I was #1 frog embryologist. What it was, the problem was that as a frog embryologist, I did not wish to speak to people in pharmaceutical companies at all. I couldn't see what they had to offer me, and I suspect they did not know what I had to offer them. I saw people as a different species, and this was illustrated when I became head of the National Institute for Medical Research, when I invited some people from a pharmaceutical company, who will remain nameless, not represented here, and who come speak to us. And they said, I cannot understand why any scientist would want to spend hours and hours in a darkened room counting cells unless it was to develop a drug. Now, that completely lost the audience because I used to spend hours and hours in a darkened room counting cells because I wanted to understand how life worked. So we had to bring together the way people understand, the mindset of the academic with the mindset of the pharmaceutical company. We did this, and in particular, we've done it with a meeting we had with Paul Peter Tak, with Patrick Vallance at London Zoo. So we went to GSK with London Zoo, and we had an I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours session. And it was fantastic. So we got together, we had the normal talks, we had speed dating, we had a few drinks, and in this meeting, which lasted a day in the zoo, we developed about 8 or 9 collaborations that are going forward now. And as a result of that meeting, GSK and the CRIC have set up a link lab. GSK is sending people into the CRIC will be sending people to GSK, and we will understand each other. We will know if we get an interesting idea at the CRIC, we have people in the CRIC with whom we can consult and get things into the translational space much, much more quickly. And I think breaking down those barriers between academic mindset and the pharmaceutical mindset, both ways, is going to be one of the single most important things that the CRIC does. And I'm grateful to GSK and Patrick and Paul Peter and Louise and everybody who is here for the work they have done in making this work. I have some more slides. I'm probably about to see a 0 at the back, which means I'm the worst frog embryologist in the world. So I'll stop there. But thanks very much, and I'm sorry I'm not David.
Okay, thank you for that last minute filling in. That was really tough, and we greatly appreciate it, and we only wish that Sir David does well and is back here soon. So, our next session is White Light, White Heat. When I first began talking about this, John Rees said, you got to have a session called White Light, White Heat. Little did I know that we were both about the same age. Most of you here will not know what that means, and it's too bad. Those of you who do, you're lucky. Our next speaker, our next convener, who's going to really start something I consider a very exciting session, is how investors in Big Pharma acknowledge that Britain, especially the Golden Triangle, has great science, but they fall behind other nations. Let me just tell you one thing about the next gentleman. When we decided on doing this conference in the middle of October, I give this gentleman a call, and he's never heard from me before. He takes my call, and I said, why are you taking my call since you're the worldwide head of life sciences in your healthcare practice, which does what, $3 billion a year?
Something like that.
A little more than $3 billion? And he said, because we are a service organization, and we talk to people all the time because we never know who we can help and who's going to be helping us. So I called him up and said, would you please convene a session? And he said, anything I can, we'll do, and our firm, hopefully, in the future will be involved more with you all. I'm from the South, Charleston, South Carolina, y'all. I'm a very impressive guy, just a very impressive guy. He brought his partner here, who's here also from, that's the head of Europe, Asia, Middle East, on and on and on, ad infinitum. I was thrilled to meet Mr. Testard, I think his name is. But anyway, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce a gentleman who's really a strategy consultant and has been so for 35 years, but knows the life sciences and healthcare industry probably better than almost anybody else. Global head, managing director, life sciences, that wonderful firm, Deloitte Touche, Mr. Pete Mooney.
Great. Thank you.
It's all yours now.
Thanks, Mallory. So let me invite our panelists up, and I've seen a few of you this morning, and I hope our third is here. There he is. All right.
Throw my bag on it's on one of the chairs here.
Up here. Alex, glad you could make it. Nice to see you. Good. So the format we'll start with here, I'll do some introductions in a second. We'll do 10-minute sessions from each of our panelists. We'll then do some discussion, and if time permits, and I assume there's somebody back there keeping time, we'll open up to right here. Okay, we'll open up to the floor and have some questions from the floor. But I think we have a great group of panelists, and I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. Down at the end, we have Alex Snow, who's the CEO of Lansdowne Partners, but is also the deputy chair of Oxford Science Innovation. So certainly has some things to say on the topic of white light, white heat, which is a very catchy title for this session, by the way. We have Paul Peter Tak sitting in the middle here, Senior Vice President, Head of Immunoinflation R&D for GlaxoSmithKline, and also the CEO of Tempuro Pharmaceuticals. So we'll contribute some of the perspective of the startup, but also the GSK pharmaceuticals industry perspective as well. And then sitting right here to my left, we have Ben Thorpe, who's the head of EMEA Healthcare Investment Banking for Goldman Sachs, so can certainly talk to the financial side of this. So I think we can start off with our 10-minute dialogues here, or discussions. We can do this alphabetically, I think, and Alex, you actually win on a first name and a second name basis, so why don't we start with you?
Decided this morning I was going to be an advocate for the defence, actually, rather than anything else. And having been very involved in university and intellectual property commercialisation in the UK for many, many years now, I was helped found and was chairman of IP Group, which we founded in Oxford. Do I need that? Which we founded in Oxford 16 years ago, and more recently co-founder of Oxford Sciences Innovation. One gets quite an interesting perspective over IP commercialisation in this country over a long period of time. And I've got to tell you, in the past 15 years, things have changed incredibly. And, you know, if I think back to the attitude towards commercialisation of IP 15 years ago, it was when tech transfer offices were just being thought about in universities, and it was kind of a new form of investing. And it took quite a long time, I have to be honest with you, and some quite tough times to get to the point where we are today. Where we are is, you know, we've just raised a dedicated amount of capital for commercialisation of intellectual property in Oxford of just under $500 million. Right? That's from some of the biggest investors in the world, not only in the UK, but right across the west coast of the USA, including Google, Sequoia Ventures and others. In my other hat at Lansdowne Partners, we were also founder investors at Imperial Innovations, Cambridge Innovation Capital, both of which have access to significant capital for this particular type of investing. And so I really don't think it's a capital problem. There is no shortage of capital that is willing to invest in high-quality science that is beginning to morph into a commercial realization. There really isn't, and there's a number of OSI people here today. If any of you are thinking of this particular process, there is infinite access to capital to help you do it. And looking on the return side as well, we did some work on the portfolio returns of IP Group since inception in 2001. And it's delivered 28.8% annual growth in its portfolio valuation since that time. Imperial Innovations has just done under 20% annual CAGR. So the portfolio returns of investing in this area are very attractive, which is why I think, in the classical economic case, you know, more capital has been attracted into it. So, you know, just looking to sort of conclude on that particular basis, you know, there's no shortage of world-class science, and there is now in 2016 no shortage of capital to help you. So if we're looking for failures and if we're looking for reasons where we're not doing well or where we're underperforming, which I suspect is one of the sub-thoughts of this conference, we need to look at somewhere else and something else, because those two clear blocks are in place. I would add to that both the UK government and indeed the European Investment Fund have been enormously supportive of this sector across the UK. The EIF has invested in IP Group for 15 years. It's announced another investment with UCL today. It's invested, and they've been, some of them are here, and they've been with us for 2 days, and I'm sure will look to also co-invest alongside Oxford as well. The UK government, with Sir John Bell, whether it be the Biobank or Genomics England, are creating enormous data which is spawning potential for huge innovation across the medical sciences division. So there is an enormous platform and opportunity. And as I say, it's quite easy to look at these things and blame something else. In this case, you know, the building blocks of opportunity are there, and we're going to have to think a little bit deeper about some of these things to really, if we are going to admit or try to examine why we are, I think the word's underperforming.
Great. Okay, thank you. Paul Peter, I think you're next. I think you're next. Okay.
So maybe it's good to make it a little bit more personal and describe briefly my background. I joined GSK 4.5 years ago, and there I lead now since recently more or less half of the portfolio at GSK. But before that time, I spent my whole life in academia. So I think I could bring different perspectives here. In my academic life, I've started a spin-off company based in the Netherlands, developing gene therapy. And indeed, I'm also the CEO of now completely owned by GSK biotech company in the Elder Cambridge in the US. So I may bring a diverse perspective with a mixed background, also culturally, living in Cambridge in the UK, which we actually do not call the other place there. I had to explain to my children this morning that I went to the other place. So obviously, I think I'm living here in a country with a very, very rich academic background. So I think it's very important to start with the strength, and I think you also pointed this out. 9 of the top 50 universities are actually based in the UK, several of which are in the top 10. I think there's a very important healthcare system which may foster, I think, science, clinical trials, clinical discoveries, and therefore it's very relevant, I think, for translation into value for the biomedical industry. I think there are incredibly strong charities like the Wellcome Trust. So this is all, I think, very important. We heard about the Cooksey report, and I think, looking at it from a little bit of a distance still, I think quite a lot has been achieved in terms of developing a more strategically coherent approach to publicly funded health research. I think in terms of continuous improvement in the translation of basic research into value for patients and economic value. I think there has been a strong emphasis on encouraging partnerships between academia, pharmaceutical industry, charities, what have you. So I think there are many reasons to be optimistic, and actually it's one of the reasons why I live here, because I see a huge opportunity, while I think 90% of the people who report to me actually live in the US. So I think that there's a big opportunity. But we also heard in the introduction by Mallory that the UK is falling behind, and I think we do need to acknowledge this, because the UK is trying to stay very competitive, but so are many other regions in the world. And I think we need to reflect on the question, why are we falling behind? And there are different ways of addressing it. I think one is actually related to investment, but more money is never the single answer to it, I think. So we do need to think about this. Is there really enough VC money? Is there enough regional venture capital? If you compare it to some of the very vibrant regions like the Elder Cambridge and Boston, but also other regions that are quite strong, like Berlin, like Shanghai, like San Diego or the San Francisco area, etc. So we do need to reflect on how can we attract more capital here, because I think there's a huge opportunity. Another element I think we need to reflect on is cultural in nature. And I don't pretend that I did any sociological research on this. So this is kind of reflection of a Dutchman living in Cambridge, but who has also lived in the US and who has a kind of diverse background, I think. What I see is that I think generalizing, people are quite risk averse, I think. Here, if you start a biotech company, there's of course always a big chance that it will fall over. That's the nature of early discovery and early science. I think that is seen as failure. And I think if you try to get a scientific answer and try to create value out of it, then it may work or it may not work, but you get a clear answer if you do it in the right way, which should be celebrated as success. And I think in the US it's probably much more normal to see that as a success. You've tried it. The science was maybe not mature enough, you didn't get the answer that you wanted, but you start all over with a new idea, you start a new company, and you may be incredibly successful. So I think this a cultural aspect is important. I think another cultural aspect that I see and that I really like in day-to-day social life is that people are extremely modest and have a tendency to downplay the success, which is really very friendly and nice, but not very helpful if you try to talk to a venture capitalist from, let's say, the United States, where the culture is different, where people may not understand that. And I would say the same would be in the Netherlands, actually, because the subtleties are way too complex for a Dutch person to understand it. So I think this is something to really think about. It may sound very simple, but I do think it's important. Cultural aspects are also important, ultimately, for how complex are the procedures. I think Mallory mentioned already how difficult can it be to get approval for an animal experiment. And to be very clear, we need to be very careful in how we design our experiments, and we need to have very high ethical standards. But at a certain time point, many of these experiments are more or less the same, and you could imagine that you can streamline the procedure. But it's not only in the preclinical space, it's also in the experimental space. I think we do believe in the UK that this country is relatively strong in the context of translational medicine and experimental medicine. And this may be true compared to the US. I think there's a cultural advantage there, because I think more patients are willing actually to participate in clinical trials that are mechanistic and experimental in nature, while there's not a clear benefit to the individual patient. I've tried that myself, actually, doing these trials both in Southern California and in the UK, and I do believe it's better. However, if you compare it to, let's say, countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, I think it's much more complicated here to do it. And many people will say, well, you can't do this in a placebo-controlled way because there's no benefit to the patient. And that's an important assumption that leads us in the wrong way here. Because if you do a phase 1b/2a clinical trial and you try to get an initial scientific answer, then you need to design the best, let's say, mouse experiment, but do it in humans. And you can't promise the patient that there will be benefit on the individual level. Actually, there's an ethical reason not to do that, and to be totally frank and clear about this. So I think these are also cultural elements that we need to, aspects that we need to talk about if we want to actually fill the many experimental medicine units that I've seen in the UK that are actually not utilized in an optimal way. So cultural elements, money. I think let's now look at it from a GSK perspective. We are a global pharmaceutical company. And we will go where the science is best, where we see the most vibrant climate, where we see the biggest opportunities, where we see the best climate in terms of the IP climate, how is the whole biotech ecosystem, etc. So we are here, so that I think is a reflection of the fact that we are very supportive and that we are very excited about the opportunities here. But when you look at the gross domestic product, it's at the moment 1.7%, more or less, in the UK, which is about 60% of that in Germany. And in a country like Finland, it's more than twice as high. It's even lower than, I think, the average for the EU. So I think we need to really reflect on this. If we want to stay really at the top of the bioscience, then we need to continue the investment as a society in academia, in biotech, and make it really attractive for the global players to stay. I think pharma also had to reflect actually on the question, what could be improved? I think we have focused already several years ago very strongly on how can we reduce attrition? In other words, how can we increase the probability of success? By working with external partners. I think pharmaceutical companies cannot do this in isolation, and therefore this whole ecosystem is critical to us. So we work in trying to be better at identification of therapeutic targets by having started the public-private partnership here in England called the Center for Therapeutic Target Validation, together with the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, together with the European Bioinformatics Institute, using genetics and genomics approaches. So I think a clear benefit here for us to be present in this region. We try to develop better molecules. I think that's actually a thing that GSK is very good at. And we try to de-risk the programs early on by experimental medicine. Again, I think this highlights the importance of building these networks and taking away all the hurdles that inhibit us from being more successful. So in summary, because I have less than 1 minute now, I think the bioscience sector in the UK is a fantastic investment opportunity. We need to make sure that we invest sufficiently, both financially and culturally and from a scientific perspective. I think a collaborative culture is critical to be successful, and that's where the UK may win, actually. And then the final point that I can't talk about because of time is that I think it's also critical to have early access for patients to good medicines, and I think that innovation should be really included in the whole calculation, whether a medicine can be reimbursed or not. Especially because more and more countries are actually looking at NICE, also countries in South America, for example, which is very important to how they look at British industry like GSK. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Ben, let's hear from you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would start with a recognition of just how much good science there is in the UK. From my vantage point, I see Glaxo, I see AstraZeneca. I also look at non-UK corporates that are also conducting a lot of research and development and scientific endeavor in the UK. But I also look to companies like Shire. I look to Celtec. I think of Humira being D2E7 and coming from the other place. I think there is recognition increasingly about the quality of science that exists outside of the US and specifically within the UK. But I would argue that capital is an issue, because if the real question today is going to be about why aren't we able to create value, why aren't we able to commercialize science, I think the reality is that in order to create value out of good science, you need capital. And I think it's very painful when you think of good science that is left on the shelf effectively and creates no value because nobody is putting the capital into it. And there, I think there remains a differential between the US and the rest of the world, particularly here. And I'm not sure that we are falling behind the US. I'm going to walk through some facts that I think say that we have been behind for quite a period of time in this regard. And if there's a silver lining, I would say we're actually catching up now. We have been catching up, I think, for the last couple of years. And let's hope that that continues. And I think today should be more about making sure that we continue to reduce the differential between the UK and the US, as opposed to arresting, a kind of further decline. If you look at performance in the public capital markets, there has been a tremendous run in biotech valuations, really centered around a 4.5-year period from the start of 2011 till March, April last year. Good news, over that period of time, public UK biotech companies more than doubled. Their share prices on average were up north of 140%. The flip side of that is, not even in the US, but in Europe, they trebled. They were up 200%. And in the US, they were up north of 500% over that same period of time. Since that peak in the early part of last year, there's been a market sell-off. And maybe there's a degree of defensive nature to the UK and Europe relative to the US. The US is off 30% over that period. UK and Europe is off around about 20%. But I would just highlight that that kind of differentiated performance in the US means that so-called sophisticated capital doesn't actually need to be that sophisticated. You can basically buy the NASDAQ Biotech Index and go to bed sleeping easy at night. You've been able to make a lot of money at it. If the index in the UK is up 140% over a 4-year period, guess what? You have to stock pick. And I think we all recognize that all biotech is incredibly risky. No one really knows whether or not it's going to work. And so for a public market investor to have to pick stocks rather than just say, I'm going to bet on biotech, which you can do in the US, I think is a big differentiating factor for the downside of UK and European biotech. That translates into access to capital. Last year, as per the article from the Daily Telegraph yesterday, was a strong year. The UK raised over $1 billion in public capital. And you compare that to the prior 15 years, since 2000, since 2001 onwards, the peak was about $400 million. So last year was outstanding. In the US, they raised north of $10 billion last year in public equity offerings for biotech companies, and the average over a 10 to 15 period is nearer $2 billion. And although there are many more companies in the US, when you look at average size of financing on a per company basis, in the US they're averaging around about $50 to $100 million, depending on the year, per fundraising. In the UK, the average is closer to 25. And so there is a clear differential in terms of the ability to access decent amounts of capital. So to me, it remains clear that the US does have broader, deeper, and I suppose inherently more sophisticated investors that provide more permanent financing and more permanent equity capital to the biotech industry in the US as opposed to Europe and the UK. However, it's not all doom and gloom. I actually think if you look at the data over the course of the last couple of years, two things have been happening. One, I think UK companies and European companies have been able to go to the US and get more access to that US capital. If you look, last year there were 8 companies in Europe that had listings on NASDAQ, Adaptimmune here being a good example, and so companies being able to just go directly to the US capital markets to access that deeper pool of capital. And also, I think as US investors have woken up to the fact that, gee, there is actually good science out of the US, and gee, given where valuations have got to in the US, maybe there's more value to be had in the UK and Europe. You've seen a greater proportion of shareholder bases of UK companies come from the US. So if you go back to 2012, the average public UK biotech company had about 12% of its investor base came from the US. Today, that's doubled to around about 24%. For what it's worth, you compare that to Europe, Europe's gone from around about 30% US shareholders to 40% over that period of time. So we doubled, we're catching up, but we are still catching up. It's not like we've overtaken even Europe in terms of getting access to those US shareholders. The other bright spot that I would mention is private financings. Again, as I think was mentioned in the Telegraph, if you look last year, there was nearly $1 billion raised for private biotech companies in the UK. That was dominated by Immunocore and the $320 million that they raised last year. But interestingly, if you actually look at UK private companies' access to capital, it actually compares very favorably with US private companies' access to capital. So on average, you get somewhere between $15 to $20 million per financing, whether you're in the UK, Europe, or the US. Last year, even if you strip out Immunocore from the data, the average financing in the US remains around about $15, $16 million. UK on average raised 24. So I think we are starting to see, and I think the work that Neil and the rest of the team at Woodford are doing in terms of leading this investment into UK biotech is a really good theme, and I think the inflow of capital from the US into the UK is another really good theme. I would just highlight, let's hope that that is a real change in the structure of how we're able to access capital and isn't a blip. And in this period of increased volatility that we're currently in, you know, we can expect some failures in the biotech community. There are always failures in the biotech community. And let's hope that that source of capital doesn't shrink back, either out of funding private companies in the UK, or indeed US investors going back and just taking their capital back to a domestic marketplace. But I actually think there are some positives.
Great, thank you. So why don't we keep that over there, Ben, because I think you guys will need it as I start to ask some questions here. So I think that's interesting that you've all kind of raised sort of this, there's an optimistic note to this message, which is we are catching up and maybe we need to catch up faster, but also that the competitive base is changing. I do see, one place to start poking in very quickly here, which is this capital discussion, because, obviously, Alex, we heard you say very early on, capital isn't the problem. But then we've also heard some issues around where capital is the problem. And it is about risk and return. And so I'd be interested in your kind of rebuttal to that.
Yeah. Pick up on a couple of those statistics, which, are clearly true. I mean, if one is constantly going to judge oneself by the law of big numbers, the US are going to have bigger numbers, right? They're just going to have bigger numbers. It's a bigger economy. So that in itself is interesting, but not definitive. The other things that were interesting that I picked up, firstly, $1 billion of UK private investment, which I think was the figure last year. More money was, in a permanent form, was committed to UK university intellectual property investment than that last year. And with some more announcements coming in the next 3 months, that number is going to be even bigger. So there is more capital being committed to university intellectual property commercialization than there is to private biotechs, which is an interesting change of statistic. And a number of that is, as you say, Neil, Lansdowne, others, but there are a lot of potential American and European investors in that as well. So actually, and the other point I make is, if you looked at the breakdown of those private investors, Immunocore, Adaptimmune obviously was an IPO, which Glaxo have just done a $500 million deal with them, announced this morning, and Oxford Nanopore. All three of those companies are based in Oxford. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of a ecosystem of success and opportunity, this is about as good as it gets, certainly in the UK, possibly in the world.
Okay. Paul Peter or Ben, any other reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think we're catching up, and I think if you look at statistics over 14 and 15, it looks a lot more positive message than if you look at statistics over the course of the last decade or so. But, you recognize that discovery and development is a long-term game, and again, if what we've seen over the last couple of years remains and is the status quo for the next decade, that will be great. Let's hope that that's the case. I sense as well, given the statistics, there may be a little bit of a differential between the availability of capital and finance for early stage research as opposed to later stage development, where the pools of capital are perhaps becoming less sophisticated and the checks are becoming bigger, and the US remains ahead in terms of financing some of those businesses, where it may be more even, or maybe even the UK is ahead with respect to financing some earlier stage research.
I realize that I'm here in between two investors, so I need to be careful what to say about finance. But I think actually we all agree that things are pretty good, right? But I do believe that more is possible in light of the fantastic scientific base in the UK. So maybe we need to really ask the question, what would be needed to be even more successful? So if we give ourselves, let's say, an 8 on the scale from 0 to 10, I would like to ask the question maybe also to the audience, is what is necessary actually to become a 9?
And you just kind of stole my next question, but if science isn't the issue, and we've got great science here, if capital isn't the issue with some of the discussion that we've had here, what would it take to put this on steroids, to accelerate it to a level that would enable it to to really take off?
And I think we need different approaches here. I touched upon some of them, which seem to be kind of soft values here, like the cultural aspects, and I won't repeat them here. I think these are important to really think about, because I think we do need to address them. I think we do need more investment, and I think we could probably more or less agree on that. Not only in terms of venture capital, I think it is very important, but also more investment actually in the science overall in the UK. And as I mentioned, other countries are catching up. We can compare ourselves to EU overall, but it's probably more interesting to look at the centers that are really very successful, like Boston, Cambridge, like Berlin, which is upcoming, other parts of the world as well. I think we also need to ask the question, why are there not more serial leaders of biotech companies in the UK? I think it's very important to attract the best people in the world, probably, to serve as a CEO who can have a successful exit strategy, move on to the next company. I think there are many more of these people in the US, also when controlled for population, than in the UK. I think we can be really innovative in how we work with the external community, and we at GSK have started to work in a very fundamentally different way, I think, very recently. Maybe I can just talk about it in a few minutes and then I will pause. And this is, as I'm an immunologist, I'm biased towards immunology, but I think it's relevant for all the therapy areas. We have started an initiative that we call the Immunology Network, and basically the idea is to work with the best scientists in the world in the space of immunology. So we have a very strong external immunology board. So far nothing spectacular, I think, except that they're very good and that they are willing to collaborate and they are kind of inclusive in behavior. But the really innovative part is that they have helped us actually to identify the rising stars in the world in immunology, and we bring them into GSK. And it's not a secret recruitment plan that I have. So I don't want to keep these people. They come for a period of 3 years, actually many of them full professors, and actually some of them much more senior than I had anticipated. The first one who joined yesterday is Luke O'Neill, who is a very famous immunologist from Dublin. So we moved them into our facilities in GSK. They continued their academic work. They continue to be an employee of the university. I'm not driving their science at all. Actually, they don't even need to discover a medicine. But they are there to be disruptive, to serve as a think tank, to really be disruptive compared to the hierarchy that we have, which is actually quite important in terms of excellence in project development. And I think it's a radical new idea of bringing academia into the walls of pharmaceutical industry with its freedom. And it could be an example where we might be very successful compared to other parts of the world by disruptive science and working in a very intense way with the academic environment that's so strong here.
Yeah, got it. Alex, you had some comments on that.
I just agree with that. Fantastic what you're doing. I mean, one of the things is interesting is the cultural point, which you mentioned very well. If I think of 2 spin-outs, and this is quite a delicate area, by the way, 2 spin-outs we've done in the past 6 months. One was in the area of genomic and genetic understanding, where Professor Donnelly and his team, the first algorithm they produced, which is used pretty much around the world, they produced open source, right? I can think of another one we've done where the bulk of this professor's work, which is again a globally recognized standard, was open source. So it does, one of the things we need to think about is, what is a job of an academic professor? Do you want to be commercial? Or do you want to provide things that improve a sector, improve humanity, and do these things? And this is a delicate area. So the cultural piece needs to be slow. It can't just be a quick, one day we're doing that, next day we're doing something different. And I think it's good it's slow. I think it's improved year on year for 15 years, and the rate of change is staggeringly impressive. So the cultural piece is really important about what is the academic work for, and that will mean different things to different people. And it'd be interesting to know, for those in the room, questions they have or thoughts they have around, do they want to create commercial entities? Now, certainly, we are seeing now a lot more do, but it shouldn't be that everyone has to operate in that way.
I think that's a very interesting point. You know, I spent a lot of time working in the U.S. and in Silicon Valley, and to Paul Peter, to your point, the failure over there and having a company or two fail is kind of a badge of honor in the U.S. Where over here, my perspective is that it's still a little bit of a black mark you don't like to talk about. I think that's changing, but it is culturally very different. The other thing you see in the U.S. on the talent side is, there is kind of this class of folks who have, either come out of the sciences and moved into business, but they are very good at how do I translate the science into achieving commercial success. And I'm not sure if that, that group really exists as well here in the UK or not. I'd be interested in, Ben, maybe you want to take a stab at that.
Look, I think it, of course, it's very individual, case-by-case specific. Having said that, if we were to generalize, I think that's probably the case. I think there is a cultural differential, certainly around your point around the acceptability of failure, but also I think the cultural differential of not being embarrassed about pursuing commercial and financial success. There is a differential, but I also agree that doesn't get changed overnight. That's a slow process around which we all need to travel.
Maybe thinking about the culture in academia, I think we also need to think about the question, how can we make it more acceptable that people in academia would move into biotech or move into industry for a certain period of time and then actually move back, right? So that you get a much more fluid system where there's cross-fertilization of knowledge all the time. And I think that's, at this moment, not very common. It does happen. I see some examples here in the room of people who've done that. But it's kind of unusual, although there would be a great benefit if it would be totally acceptable. And I think, interesting enough, when I speak with scientists, let's say outside Oxford, at other universities, then sometimes they really don't realize how much science and research is done actually in pharmaceutical industry. They seem to believe that medicines land from heaven, more or less, and then it's the task of a pharmaceutical company to sell them. And I often get the question, so how is it? Do you miss the science? Now you moved from a full professorship into industry. And say, you know what, actually I have much more time for science. And seriously, that is the case. Than I had in my previous job, where I spent a lot of time on administration, actually, and writing grants. So I think we really need to start to talk about these points, because I think they're very important.
Okay. So another question I want to bring up, and I know this will come up throughout the day, is kind of the whole technology transfer and translation part of this. And I'm struck looking at universities, and I do a lot of work with MIT and Carnegie Mellon in the U.S., who have pretty altruistic models in terms of how they do tech transfer. Carnegie Mellon will basically says we want 5% of the company, you own the IP, go forth and do your thing. And I'm not sure that is, that's facilitated some great commercialization in the U.S. through that. How much do you think that is an issue? Does that have some implications on, whether capital is interested in coming in, depending on that structure? How does that all play into it? Alex, why don't you take a stab?
Well, it's important. I mean, these things are priced for a market. Okay, so if they don't represent risk appropriately, the market will dry up. So you'd hope that it'll get to whether it be equity splits or license income or whatever it is. Eventually, over time, they'll find a point where they can trade, they can meet, right? Yeah. Otherwise, the gap becomes too wide. I think the other thing is, though, speed of facilitation. Building a successful commercial company out of some world-class disruptive IP is not easy, right? This is not an easy thing to do, and it can take a lot of time, and you have to be, quite determined, right? As you say, these things don't just drop out of the sky. So I do think the creation of these things needs to be an enjoyable one, and one that doesn't go on indefinitely. That the thing can, needs to have energy and excitement at the start. If there's too many processes, procedures, controls on them that it takes 9 months and everyone's sort of given up before they start, I think that's a problem.
Yep.
But broadly, on the numbers, I mean, it'll be what the market will bear ultimately.
Good point. Paul Peter, why don't you talk on that?
Maybe it's good to briefly speak about the model, one of the many models that we have to work with the external environment, with academia, and what the commercial reward could be actually for the academics. I think if you have a discovery as an academic, let's say professor, you can basically publish it, right? And that's fine, and then it's general knowledge. You can start your own biotech company. if you are entrepreneurial and you can find venture capital, but that's not something for everybody, in part related to the reasons that I just mentioned. But you could also do a third thing, and that's what we've called the DPAC model, the Discovery Partnership with Academia, which is really to help those people who do not want to start their own company, but they do want to develop their idea from basic idea into a medicine for patients, which is of course very important because I think in academia you do not only want to publish papers, but it would be fantastic to change the health of patients, at least as a physician. That has always been my dream. So what do we do with the DPAC model? And it's a very competitive model, so we try to select the best ideas in academia, where we believe that there's a target that could be tractable, where we believe that there's a basic understanding of the pharmacology that would be needed actually to interfere with that pathway, where we believe that the academic group is world-class and that they bring skills and capabilities that we do not have, that we cannot find elsewhere, at least not easily. Where we believe that GSK has actually something to contribute to translate that idea into ultimately a medicine. And then we form a team, basically it's a kind of functional small biotech company consisting of the scientists from academia who work shoulder to shoulder with the scientists from GSK with deep knowledge about drug discovery, chemistry, biology, there's medical input, and although it's a small group, they have access to the big platforms that we have to offer. And basically, you can create, I think, a medicine in this way, in an integrated way, all the way from basic idea, often before high-throughput screening, up to approval of a medicine. I think we have about 50% of our programs now in DPAC based in the UK, which is, again, I think, a reflection of the high level of the science here. And so what does it mean in terms of the financial model? We actually try to pay less money early on than many academic institutions actually want to see. I think many universities, including those where I've worked in the past, overrate actually the value of the discovery that they have. So we would rather pay less at that moment because many programs will fall over. However, while the program matures, there's a milestone-based payment. So the academics will be rewarded, and it also includes royalties on sales. So there's a big reward here, I think, and actually the academics also become part of the risk, actually, that we will take over time and that we will de-risk over time.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Share in the risk and don't front-end load it, in effect. Ben, how about a few thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, I think when you talk about the difference between the US and the UK in terms of how IP and tech is transferred out, I think there is a differential. I think, as Alex said, I think there is a market that can be found as we move forward. I think you look towards groups that are effectively going to act as almost clearinghouses, and whether there's multiple relationships with multiple different academic organizations, and being somewhat agnostic as to where the science has come from. I think the pharma industry, the large pharma industry, Glaxo and the like, have had to shift over the course of the last decade to recognizing that all the best science in the world does not sit within their labs and they need to go and look elsewhere. Even the rhetoric around Oxford versus Cambridge, I mean, who cares? I mean, really, sometimes I think we do question, do we hold ourselves back with putting up some of those barriers where, science is science, let's figure out the good stuff from the bad stuff and let's put capital into that and get on with it.
Yeah, and let that kind of drive the equation.
Who cares whether it came from the UK or came from elsewhere? Let's just do it.
Okay. So I think we have a few minutes, very few minutes left. But why don't we throw it open to the audience for a couple of questions here if we can, and I see a gentleman right here in the middle.
Yeah, hi guys. Very viewpoints. Just an observation regarding funding. It's quite patchy. If you're in Oxford, you're in Cambridge, you've got source of capital. If you're not, it's difficult. I'd also add, if you look at the 600 million raised this year, you exclude Woodford and Syncona fundraisers where they've helped lead the round. You've probably got just north of 100 million raised. So that shows that this is very over-dispersed in terms of the type of investor. structural issues, I think, that need to be addressed. And secondly, if I may quickly, in terms of quality of management, you've all been very kind about quality of management, you haven't touched on it. But I used to work in the city, well, 15 years ago, that's when I started, dealing with companies, and there were many people in the investment community who were of the view that that 90% of biotech management were either cowboys or clowns. They're harsh, I know, but if you look back over our track record, there have been quite a lot of high-profile failures, and that's impacted the investment community. So with respect to the structure of investment, and respect to how investors view biotech and perhaps the quality of management, what would be the panel's views, please?
Anyone want to take that? Go ahead, Ben.
I agree with a lot of what you said. I think if you were in a bar in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you told someone you were thinking about starting a career investing in biotech, that person would look back over the last 20 years of the US and say, go for it, I'm sure you'll do very well. If you were a bar in Cambridge, UK, and you said, I'm thinking about starting a career investing in UK biotech, they'd say, good luck, can I buy you a drink now? And pretty sure I'll be buying you a drink in years to come. You know, that's the nature of it. On this management point, look, I'm not sure actually there is a differential between the quality of the individuals. I think that comes back a little bit to this cultural view of, you know, acceptability of, you know, different perspectives, acceptability of failure. You know, I'm not sure that UK biotech is any more, you know, mercurial and exotic a group than other parts of the world, but maybe there's just more focus from over a longer period of time, a less sophisticated group, because there's less ability to evaluate the science. You have to put more trust in the individual. You know, I mean, I think on one hand you should say, look, the science is what the science is. It doesn't really matter who the CEO is. But if you can't evaluate the science, you have to go to the CEO, look them in the white of the eyes and say, do I trust this individual? Mm-hmm. You know, and dare I say it, maybe if you have an investment community that's more able to evaluate the science, there's less need to assess management.
Yeah. Should we take another question? How about right here in front?
I believe, like all of you, I think, that we have lots of expertise, we've got brilliant infrastructure, we've now got a lot more funding, not as much as the US, but I don't worry about money because I think money is international. But I think the discussion of what people rise up around this culture and leadership, I think that's where we need to do more. Now, Paul Grayson, a couple of years ago, came to office and gave a presentation and said, we should applaud fellow academics who drive their courses to follow path. And that's what we need to see more of. I do think there is one thing that I think...
You should take a show of hands up.
The UK and Europe is unique over the US. You know, we all recognize that some of these big innovations are going to come if we break down boundaries between disciplines, but also boundaries between institutions and organizations. I do believe that GSK, and the people I'm talking about, the Wellcome Trust, the IMI, and now the SPRIT, I think we are breaking down boundaries more in the UK and Europe than we are in here. And that is going to be a big advantage for us.
What I would just like to finish with, particularly with this sort of biotech and medical hat on, and specifically in Oxford, you've got the most phenomenal leadership within, in my view, across the whole medical platform with Sir John, but all the heads of departments are collaborative, united, clear. You've got fantastic funding. You're doing some amazing new building projects. I mean, just staggeringly forward-thinking. You're attracting some amazing people, developing amazing science. And what's wrapped around you is, through us and through others, a large, significant, largest amount ever dedicated amount of money raised for one academic institution in the world, wrapped around that to help the commercialization. And you've got, on top of that, huge industrial contacts and Immunocore, Oxford Nanopore, Adaptimmune, huge beginnings of a slate and scorebook of great success. Is there a gap? Isn't there a gap? I don't know. But I do know that the outlook for the next 5 years is staggeringly good. There are lots of bits that we'll tweak and improve, and that I'm sure will get done. But the building blocks for great success have never been better.
I think we have time for one more question. So we go for someone in the back. How about
upstairs?
How about upstairs? I can't even see that.
Thank you very much for this informative discussion. I'd like to ask why we continue to raise our navel and discuss UK versus the US and big pharma only. If you look to the east, LG, Life Sciences, Chung-Ham and other big corporations, with the history of investing in other forms of innovation are beginning to invest in biotech. Is there anything we should learn, vary of, or take advantage from that position?
Great question. We also just had a Chinese bid on Syngenta today, as I read in the paper. How about the impact of the East here?
I totally agree with you, and that's why I try to say in a subtle way, we are a global company, so we will be where the science and the vibrant environment leads us. And we are, for example, quite active in Shanghai and in other parts of China and other parts of the Far East as well. So I think that's the global field, actually. And if we want to think about the creating value for patients and for the British economy by investments in this field, then I think we need to be very competitive. And we can conclude that things are quite good, and I think I would clearly agree with that. But the world is developing at a very rapid pace. In some areas, certainly also in the East, are going very fast. I think we need to keep an eye on that and make this place really attractive, attract talent from there, actually, attract capital from there as well, and turn it into a benefit.
Alex, Ben, I'll give you each a last word on this one.
Look, with respect to accessing capital on a more global basis, I agree. And I think there is potential, but it remains potential today. Although I think there's been, when we were involved on the Syngenta side of the transaction that you referenced, it's quite clear that there has been instruction to put capital to work in important industries and to be agnostic with respect to location from that part of the world. And I think that's, candidly, for companies like ChemChina and others, that is incredibly empowering. And I think we can take something away from that with how we think about allocating our own capital and encouraging people to think about accessing science.
Alex, last word.
Just answer that one question. I can't remember who asked it about the narrowness of funders. It was all Woodford and Syncona or something. I mean, I can't speak for them. I mean, I raised the money for Oxford Sciences with my co-founder David Norwood. We stopped at £350 million. I could have raised £1 billion, and that was from people all over the world. And we said no to a huge amount of people all over the world. So Woodford he's one of my shareholders. He's a fantastic guy, and he's stimulated a lot of this, as has Pete Davis from Lansdowne and others. But this was incredibly broad-based. So, and the interesting reverse message from that is there are people around the world, from Google to Sequoia to the West Coast, and still conversations we're having in Singapore and others, who think this is worth investing in. So this isn't a narrow group of sort of little cabal of people. This is very, very broad-based.
My point was that if yourself, Woodford or Syncona weren't in, people were sometimes reluctant to follow. And you've done a first-class job in terms of leadership.
Well, thank you. I think that was the case 5 years ago, but honestly, you'll see some announcements coming from this sector in the next 3 or 4 months, and you'll see it's really rightly, which is your point, growing away from that and becoming much more broad-based.
Okay, panel, I think we're going to have to leave it there because I'm getting the high sign, and we need to move on. But thank you very much. Fascinating discussion.
What a great group. We have about 22 minutes to grab a cup of coffee, thanks to Sidley Austin. And we're going to start at 11 sharp. What a fabulous group that we just had, and the next one should be just as good.
There you go.
They come up here with the packs. Can you just grab them? I just need to nip out and check something on that other system. Yeah, all right.
I think looking at it, you know, like you have this kind of to do.
On the other hand, have a drug where
you end up with a very profound impression. And I think at the time, I was what's the consequence? We know that the only time we knew of those who were and it was very bad. And yet, the same thing but we didn't know. So that's over the there were a lot of changes going on. Yeah.
You got the trouble to St Pancras then? Or then you got the bus from
Am I going to where? Yeah, hi Natalie, how are you? He looks splendid, doesn't he? Is it far from the lights and houses?
So, are you on there? Only when I was that's why
Any sign of microphone?
One brought up.
One back, the mouse.
There's the pack.